Alright gang, a special department within the Empire has hired nvRanger and co. to do a comprehensive population report on their home country of Cyrodiil. Now within this population report, we're not only going to look at the country as a whole, but we're also going to look at each specific city and then the greater county that city is within. The reason for this is because the cities within their walls have a specific population, but then within the larger county, you also have villages, farms, locations like this that add to that population. We're not just going to look at the total population numbers either, we're going to do a comprehensive demographic breakdown for each city, the county, and then the country as a whole as well. The demographics will be distinguished by race. Of course, Cyrodiil sits in the center of the continent of Tamriel and thus is surrounded by all of the other countries on that continent. We can specifically display the relevance of this by looking at a map of Cyrodiil and all of its counties. Here you'll see that each county shares a border with another country, sometimes multiple countries. Cyrodiil may be home to the Imperials, but how do they actually stack up to the other races in terms of population, depending on the city or county you're in? Does Bruma really have more Nords than Imperials? Are there really significantly more Dark Elves in Cyrodiil given how close it is to Morrowind? What areas have the most Orcs or the least Imperials? We can answer all of these questions through doing this report. And beyond that, on a meta level, we can see how much attention to detail was put into displaying these areas as we are told they're meant to be. It's one thing to say that the Blackwood and County Leowen is home to many beast races, but it's an entirely different thing to get a quantitative value as to how that representation is actually appearing. Our process is going to look like this. We're going to look at each city and then its respective county, ending with the Imperial city in the Heartlands, and then at the end we'll look at Cyrodiil overall. We have 9 cities in total, but there are actually 11 counties when we include the Imperial Reserve and the Nibene Basin, which do have populations of their own. Now, a portion of the Nibene Basin is within County Cyrodiil, but it also has its own county. The population within that distinct county won't be counted in Cyrodiil's population. The Empire has requested that bandits and other unscrupulous types not be considered in our report. Lastly, unnamed guards do not count. They cannot count. If you see a guard, be sure to let them know they cannot count. 1, 2, 3. What comes next? Don't ask them because they don't count. I won't hear any more of this. If you are a guard, please unkindly see yourself out. Like and subscribe before you go. First up today is the Gold Coast's city of Anvil. Anvil sits on the Abyssian Sea and is closest to the border of Valenwood, and it also shares a border with Hammerfell. And perhaps as we go through these numbers for a more quote-unquote realistic representation as to the numbers of these cities, you might want to consider one individual representing 1,000. So our total population here in Anvil is 70. Maybe you want to say that's 70,000. Despite being considered a relatively small city, Anvil's population is quite large, and perhaps this is because it's the closest city to Kvatch and they have a lot of refugees pouring in. Again, we're going to keep an eye out for what kind of role geography plays into the race distribution of each city and county, and here in Anvil, we have Imperials as the most common race at 16 or 16,000, and then Wood Elves, given our proximity to Valenwood, take up that second spot at 13,000, and then Red Guards, who are from Hammerfell, are taking up that third spot. So the two closest countries are reflected here. As we can see, the second and third most common races are from those two closest countries. The least common races in the city of Anvil are the Argonians and Orcs, tied for second to last at 2,000, and then the Khajiits at the bottom at 1,000. We also have this number up here next to our total population, which is our Shannon Diversity Index score. The Shannon Diversity Index measures both richness, or the number of different groups within our studies, which is races in this case, and then evenness, how evenly distributed the population is across those groups. We can see here for Anvil, the index score is 2.04 diversity, and it's considered high. 0 means there is no diversity. One race makes up 100% of the population, whereas 2.04 or 2.5 means you have fairly even representation across most or all races. Given that we have 10 different races, the maximum possible diversity score would be 2.3. So we're a bit of a ways off from the maximum one. Of course, we can see this in our data, given this is not even at all, but we also can see that we're very far from having no diversity where one race makes up 100% of the population. And please do your best to keep the culture wars out of this. This isn't a DEI message. This is just looking at data and math. That's all this is. I'm not telling you it's better to have a more diverse Oblivion city or a less diverse Oblivion city. We're just looking at the data that we have. And now we can bump this over to the county of Anvil, the greater county, where we see the population goes from 70,000 to 79,000. So, of course, the vast majority of people within this county are within the city of Anvil, and then we tack on an extra 9,000 outside of those city walls. And of course, Portside for Anvil is included as the city as well. We don't see much change towards the top end of our list. It stays pretty much the same with the Imperials, Wood Elves, and Red Guards, but then we do see the Nords break that tie with the Bretons and take the 4th place spot, and the Dark Elves actually jump up quite a bit, and they're at a tie with the Bretons in terms of population. And then when we head towards the bottom end, we see a 3-way tie where the Argonians, Khajiits, and Orcs all lock in. And then we can also see that diversity index score bump up ever so slightly from 2.04 to 2.06. And then just taking a quick glance at the bar graph, you can see that a couple of races bumped up a little higher and things are slightly more even. So that's where we get that number increasing slightly. We can also see that more than 50% of the population is contained within those top 3 races in the Imperials, Wood Elves, and Red Guards. Moving on to the city of Bravil, we can see it has a total population of 57,000, considerably less than Anvil. What's more interesting is the most common race in Bravil is not the Imperials. The Imperials aren't even the 2nd most common race here. We can see that for some reason, Bretons are at number 1, and then the Dark Elves aren't far behind. Maybe someone looking for a job here at nvRanger & Co. can explain why the Bretons are a significant portion of the population in Bravil. High Rock, their home country, is nowhere near Bravil. The racial breakdown of Bravil is kind of fascinating when you think about it because it's considered a den of iniquity. There's a lot of skooma and crime. It's not a great place. So, of course, even the Imperials don't want to live there. But then when you look at the most common races, one would assume perhaps that it would be comprised mostly of Khajiit and Argonians, but that's not the case. Maybe that's a bit presumptuous of me, but we also see the High Elves at a tie for 3rd with the Imperials. I would not have expected to see the nose-up hoity-toity High Elves being a considerable portion of the population in a place that's considered the slums of Cyrodiil. For our bottom 3 races here in Bravil, we have the Nords and Orcs tied at 2nd to last, so again we have a tie down here. The Nords not being here makes sense. They like the cold, they like the north. It doesn't seem like they would like the swamps. And then the Orcs are generally just a less common race altogether. The least common race in Bravil is the Red Guard, however, because they have no one. There is not a single Red Guard within the city of Bravil. And we do see we have a 2.12 diversity score for Bravil, which makes sense. You can even see this on the bar graph here, where we have a significant number of ties. Then when we expand to the greater county of Bravil, we go from 57,000 to 62,000, and we do see a small population of Red Guards appear in that greater Bravil area. The demographics remain largely the same, but we do see the tie between Imperials and High Elves get broken, with the High Elves bumping up to solidify 3rd place as the 3rd most common race in Bravil. Very strange. So even within their home country of Cyrodiil, the Imperials are not even in the top 3 for the most common races within Bravil. Also worth noting, unlike in Anvil where you had more than 50% of the population within the top 3 races, this is not the case and Bravil County, you would have to go to the top 4. For the third city, we're going to head up north towards Skyrim in Bruma, and boy can you see Skyrim's impact on the demographics of this city. First of all, we have a population of 49,000 within Bruma, so our smallest so far. You can also see the diversity index score is considerably lower than the previous 2 cities at 1.75, and that changes its category down to moderate. There's often this talk of Bruma being more Skyrim than Cyrodiil, and we can see this represented in the demographics quite clearly. Nords take up 38.8% of the population within the city of Bruma. Imperials do maintain second place this time at just over 1/4 of the population though. So in this city, you can see it's not the top 4 races or the top 3 races that are making up more than 50% of the population. It's just the top 2, and they're actually a lot closer to 65% of the total population. In third place, you have the Bretons, and you'll see this as a consistent marker. The Bretons are always having some legitimate sized population within almost every city. They are well represented in Cyrodiil. Then you can see we have 2 3-way ties at the bottom end of the bar graph. Now, when we expand our data pool to the larger county of Bruma, we can see that the population has a massive jump. It goes from 49,000 to 72,000. And we also see the gap between Nords and Imperials closes quite a bit. This is largely due to Cloud Ruler Temple. There's a significant population up there, and it's comprised of the Blades, who are meant to protect the Emperor of the Empire, the Imperial Empire, so that's why there's a big jump in Imperials. You also see the Bretons getting a decent increase as well. Another change we see as we move to the county data is the Dunmer. The Dark Elves jump up to 4th place. They were previously tied in last place. It also makes quite a bit of sense that Khajiit, Argonians, and Wood Elves, given their home climates, aren't going to be huge fans of this northern wintry mountain area, and thus they don't have huge populations. And despite the large jump in population, we don't see that diversity index score rise very much. It goes up by 0.4, but it's still in moderate. Now I have to make my way east towards Morrowind and the city of Cyrodiil. This is probably my favorite city from an aesthetic perspective, but that's besides the point. Again, of course, this is close to Morrowind, and it's known for having an influx of Dunmer refugees or Dark Elves, and we can clearly see that in the population where, again, the Imperials are not the most common race in the population or makeup of one of their own cities. I think this is interesting to dig into and think about a bit, because now we've looked at our 4th city, and one of those 4 cities had the Imperials as the majority population within their demographics. We've seen 3 in a row where they're not. I'm curious what you guys think about this. Is this a result of Cyrodiil again being in the center of the continent of Tamriel? It shares a border with more nations, and thus is just more likely to receive an influx of immigrants. It's a hub of commerce, the seat of the empire, all of those things. Or from a more meta level game design analysis, is this because Bethesda is trying to give us a varied and nuanced experience when playing their games, so they end up changing the regions and perhaps compromising the integrity of each nation to show more flavor, if you will. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Of course, it could be a bit of both, but anyway, Cyrodiil has a population of 59,000, and again, the majority population here is Dark Elves, and then you have Orcs and Imperials tied for second. So we finally see the Orcs actually move up into a significant spot on the bar graph, and then when we look towards the bottom end, their presence is of course not there. You have Nords, Redguards, and Wood Elves at a tie for second to last, and then Khajiits being the least common race in Cyrodiil. When we expand into the greater county of Cyrodiil, we see a 10,000 population increase from 59,000 to 69,000. The Dark Elves maintain their top spot, but not quite as dominantly. The Orcs are actually going to jump up into second place above the Imperials. So now the Imperials have dropped into third. Once again, they're not even the second most common in one of their own cities. We also see the Nords jump up above the Argonians and reach a tie with the Bretons, and then the Khajiit are going to jump up into a tie with the Redguards, and they will maintain the bottom end of the population. The diversity index score for both the city and county of Cyrodiil is quite high at 2.14 and 2.18 respectively. Next, I'll make a journey back west to start pointing out and counting people in the city of Coral. Now, first thing of note, despite being geographically a pretty large city, it's quite spacious. Coral has an incredibly small population when compared to the other cities at only 35,000. We can also see a major shift in the demographics. The Imperials are no longer in third or second. They are clearly the most common race in the city of Coral. They make up over 37% of the total population, or more than a third. What's also interesting about Coral's demographics is there isn't a clear dominant second place. We have orcs sitting there at 5,000, but they're actually closer numerically to the Wood Elves, which don't have anybody within the city of Coral at 0, than they are to the Imperials at 13,000. Beyond that, if you add up the percentages of the bottom 8 of the 10 potential races, you don't even reach 50%. So we have more than 50% of the population in Imperials and Orcs in Coral. Now, as we adjust our perspective from the city of Coral to the county, we're going to have a huge population jump from 35,000 to 55,000. And our diversity index score is actually going to drop a decent bit because, as you'll see, the Imperials will gain an even larger percentage of that pie chart, going from 37.1 to 41.8% of the total population. We also see the Orcs lose that second place position as the Bretons increase and gain a tie with them, and then we see the Redguards drop out of third place and end up in a tie with the Nords. Based on our geography theory, where proximity to certain nations has an impact on the demographics, we could see that in the city, Redguards and Orcs had a larger foothold, and Coral is closer to Hammerfell, home of the Redguards, and then Orsinium's up there somewhere, so perhaps that explained the population of Orcs. But when we expand to the county, this kind of falls apart. They don't have that same demographic foothold. But on the same note, Coral is also relatively close to Skyrim for the Nords and then High Rock for the Bretons, so it doesn't fall apart completely. And although we do see that some races don't have a presence within the cities, we maintain the trend that as long as we expand out into the county, we see each race have some sort of representation within each county, and the Wood Elves do have that here in County Coral. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave Coral, tiptoe through the Imperial Reserve into the destroyed city of Kavach. Now, the Daedra should probably have the largest population here, but we're not counting them, and we can also see that the population here generally is much lower than even Coral, which was our previous smallest city. Kavach is a difficult city to get a read on because we don't know what it looked like prior to its destruction. It was supposedly the second largest city in Cyrodiil behind the Imperial city, so these numbers don't really reflect that. What's also different about this city is the majority of its population is not within the city walls anymore. They're at a camp down the mountain from it, and for that reason and the overall low population, I'm just going to go ahead and switch over to the full county view. We only go from 17,000 to 19,000. Another minor shift is the city itself had a 1.79 diversity index rating, which put it in moderate, but when we switch out to the county, it bumps up to 1.87, and that gets it into high. Ultimately, that's still relatively low given the other cities that we've looked at. The Imperials are going to be the majority race within this county. The Redguards are just behind them. This sort of makes sense given their proximity to Hammerfell. However, much like Anvil, Kavach sits closer to Valenwood, home of the Wood Elves, and we don't see them having a significant population here. They're tied in third with High Elves and Breton. Kavach is also a first in that both city and county contain no Dark Elves or Khajiit, so we lose that trend of having at least one of each race within each county. That's not the case in Kavach, and you can understand why. There's not a whole lot to look at here. Quite literally, they barely have half the population of many of the other cities. People have either fled or been killed, so I am also going to flee. flee all the way down south to Bravil if it were good, the city of Leeuwin. The city of Leeuwin has a population of 68,000 and a diversity index of 1.91. This is relatively low, even though it still sits at the high end. When we look at our bar chart here and the pie graph, we can see that Imperials actually maintain the #1 spot. I'm kind of surprised by this. I figured how far away it is from the center of Cyrodiil and being wedged in between Elsewhere and the Black Marsh. I figured maybe the beast races would overtake them, but nope, this isn't the case. Imperials make up 1/4 of the total population, and then you have Argonians at 23.5% and Khajiit at 20.6%. This is pretty interesting because Leeuwin is technically closer to Elsewhere than it is Black Marsh, but Argonians are still in second place. And perhaps that's because the city is in a very swampy, wet region that lends itself towards the Argonians, although both races are still well represented here. What is quite fascinating about the city of Leeuwin is that when we consider the racial makeup of Bravil, its sister city along the Niben River, Bretons were the largest population within that city. They were #1. But when we look at Leeuwin, they don't have anybody. There are 0% Bretons within Leeuwin, the city at least. So for whatever reason, the two cities available along the Niben River in Cyrodiil, they chose to all go to the worst one and nobody wants to go to Leeuwin. But then when we expand our view to Leeuwin County, we see quite a dramatic shift. Now, first of all, the Imperials lose their position in #1. They drop below the Khajiits. So we see that Khajiit representation, again, being closer to Elsewhere, show its face. They take up over 1/4 at 25.9%. The population overall goes from 68,000 to 85,000, so quite a large bump. And then beyond that, quite strange, the Bretons do gain a presence and they move all the way from 0, bottom last, to 4th place. For whatever reason, they don't want to live within the city walls of Leeuwin, but they are present in the county and quite significantly. Oddly enough, the Argonian population doesn't shift at all. All of the Argonians that are in Leeuwin County are within Leeuwin City. This also means that the High Elves and Red Guards are the least populous demographic within Leeuwin. Furthermore, the game's narrative indicates racial tensions in Leeuwin between the beast races and the Imperials, and we can really see that represented in the demographic breakdown, where the majority of the population is within those 3 relevant races. For our final city before we get to the Imperial City, I'll head up to the West Weald where we'll find Skingrad. Oddly enough, Skingrad is the only county where we don't see a population increase when we go from the city to that greater county. This means that the entire population of the county is concentrated in and around Skingrad. The city of Skingrad is technically closer to Valenwood, which is home of the Wood Elves, and we do see them having a population here in decent significance, but County Skingrad does share a border with Elsewhere. However, we do not see them having any population in the city and, of course, the county. We do see that the Imperials are the most common individual race within Skingrad at 28.6%, and then the two races tied in second place, the Bretons and the Nords, are half of their population. So over 50% of the population is going to be concentrated in those top 3, and then when we go towards the lower half, we can see we have a 4-way tie between the Dark Elves, High Elves, Orcs, and Red Guards. And now briefly, before we get to the Imperial City, we'll take a look at those two counties that don't have a major city in them, starting with the Imperial Reserve, which has a population of only 4,000. The majority of people here are High Elves, and then you have Imperials and Nords. Here's where you can see that diversity index really drop. It's still in moderate, but it's only 1.04. But then when we go to that southern half of the Nibene Basin, we can see an even lower population at only 3,000, and an even lower diversity index, which is actually in low this time at 0.64. Here we only have two different demographics, with over 66% being Breton and then the rest being Imperial. Now I can finally make my way over to the Imperial City, which is supposed to be not only the capital of Cyrodiil, but perhaps Tamriel as a whole, the center of it all, right in the middle of Lake Rumar. We are told this is supposed to be a giant city, and we can see that reflected in the total population, which is 190,000. This is much larger than all of the other cities. And given this is the capital of the Imperial's homeland, we can see them well represented in the demographics. They make up 34.7% of the total population. There are 66,000 Imperials within this city alone, which is larger than some of the other cities' entire populations. Beyond that, in second place, the Bretons aren't even half of the Imperial population. Then you have Dark Elves and Red Guards tied in third place. Below them are Wood Elves, then High Elves, then Nords, then Argonians, Orcs, and Khajiits. There's only one tie out of this whole makeup. Each race does have a presence here in the Imperial City, and all of them are above 5,000. Again, the Khajiits are the least common race in the Imperial City. When we expand from just looking at the Imperial City to the Greater Heartlands, we do see a decent population jump from 190,000 to 212,000. As we widen our scope, however, the Imperials drop in percentage for the overall population, and we see the Bretons gain the largest increase. The Khajiits shift out of their last place position and go into a tie with the Argonians, and the Orcs unfortunately drop into the least populous race. Also, unfortunately for them, within the heartlands of Cyrodiil, we do see that every race has at least 10,000 members aside from the Orcs. They're just outside of the scope of that at 9. Okay, so we've been a bit racial for quite some time. We're going to drift away from that for just a bit and take a look at the percentages of the cities and their population compared to the overall population of Cyrodiil. So first, we're going to compare the city populations, and then we'll compare the counties and see how they stack up against one another. So the total population within cities is 601,000. The most populous, unsurprisingly, is the Imperial City at 190,000. This takes up 31.6% of Cyrodiil's total city population. That's not very surprising, but when we look at the other cities, I actually did find some of this surprising. I thought Anvil was supposed to be one of the smaller cities, but it turns out in terms of population, it's actually the second largest. Then you have Leowin just below that with 68,000, and then you have Shadinal, Bravil, and Skingrad, who are all pretty close to one another. I recall reading that Skingrad was supposed to be the third largest city in Cyrodiil behind the Imperial City and then Kvatch, but after Kvatch was destroyed, Skingrad would then move up into that second place. However, this doesn't seem to be the case at all when it comes to population. The smallest city is technically Kvatch, but we can assume that's due to its destruction, so really the smallest city in Cyrodiil is Coral. Now let's expand our data pool once again to the counties, and we can see the population goes from 601,000 to 716,000, and again the Imperial City County, or the Heartlands, is the largest of them all. Anvil City was the second largest, but after we take in the county data, we can see it drops below Leowin. Leowin has 85,000 people in that county. It's a good bit larger than Anvil. Then we also see Bruma jump from third to the bottom to being over 10% of the overall population when we factor in its entire county. Another key takeaway here is of the counties with major cities, Skingrad and Coral are some of the smallest, especially when we don't include Kvatch. This is especially surprising because in terms of the actual area and the landmass that the cities themselves take up, these are some of the largest cities in Cyrodiil. Perhaps this is because Skingrad is quite expensive to live within, and then Coral is decently isolated out in the Great Forest and doesn't have a major river running next to it. Okay, now we can hop back over to the races and look at what percentage each of them holds across the total population of Cyrodiil. Again, the total population is roughly 716,000, give or take a couple thousand, and we can see the largest racial population within Cyrodiil is, of course, the Imperials. This is to be expected. I would be very surprised if this wasn't the case. In second place, with just above half of the population of Imperials, we have Bretons, and then Nords make up over 10% of Cyrodiil's population. This is kind of crazy, perhaps a coincidence, but those three races make up exactly 50% of the total population. Of that other 50%, you have the Dark Elves taking the largest slice out of that at 9.64%, and then Red Guards are below them. Just a little bit below the Red Guards are the Wood Elves, then the High Elves, Argonians, Khajiits, and the smallest population within Cyrodiil is the Orcs. And perhaps this was somewhat intentional. The Khajiits and Argonians, the beast races, are at a tie at 6.42% of the population each. The top 3 most populous races in Cyrodiil are all at least part human, with the Bretons being half human, half elf, but of course the Imperials and Nords are all human. And we're just going to keep ripping into this data. We're going all the way. So now we're going to look at where each race is most commonly found, starting with the Argonians, which have a total population of 46,000. To no surprise, you will find the majority of Argonians in Cyrodiil in Leyawiin County, with the Imperial City County, or the Heartlands, being right behind that, not actually that close though. And then the least common area for Argonians would be Kavach or Bruma. This is also not very surprising. The Bretons, of course, have a very large population across Cyrodiil, and you'll find most of them within the Heartlands around the Imperial City. For the purposes of being concise, when I list the least common area for these races, I'm not going to mention one of those smaller counties like the Nibene Basin that doesn't have a major city, or Kavach, because this is just sort of self-explanatory. You'll find the least amount of Bretons in Coral and Cyrodiil. You'll also find the largest percentage of Dark Elves in and around the Imperial City in the Heartlands. Just behind that is unsurprisingly Cyrodiil, and then the least common area for them is Skingrad and Leyawiin, which is also tied with Coral. So we have a 3-way tie for the Dark Elves and their least common areas. And it seems, just based on its size alone, the Imperial City is often going to be the place where we see the majority of a lot of these populations. And for High Elves, this is the case as well, again, in and around the Imperial City. And then Bravil is just behind that, oddly enough. That one's pretty strange. And then the least common areas for them is Leyawiin, which is tied with Kavach and Coral. You'll find the most amount of Imperials in the Imperial Heartlands. This makes sense. Behind that is Coral. And again, the smallest percentage of Imperials is in Bravil. That should tell you something about that city. Similar to Argonians, we have the largest percentage of Khajiits in Leyawiin. So you see that with all of the other races so far, at least, they've had a majority percentage in the Heartlands, but here we can see the majority of the beast races are in Leyawiin County. This is even more drastic for the Khajiits though, because we can see almost half of their population is in Leyawiin County. You have very small percentages for other counties such as Anvil, Bruma, and Coral. Nords clearly like to stay close to their homeland, so you'll find the majority of them in Bruma, and you'll find the least amount of them in Leyawiin County down south in those swamps, which is unsurprisingly tied with Bravil. Orcs are pretty spread out, but you'll find the largest population of them in Cyrodiil County, and the smallest population of them in Bruma. I'm not sure if it's the Cold or the Nords. I think it's the Nords. Most Redguards can be found in the Imperial City or the Heartlands, and then right behind that is Anvil County. The least common place to find a Redguard is in the swamps. It seems Bravil and Leyawiin are the smallest percentages for them. And then finally, last and perhaps least, the Wood Elves find themselves in a tie for the most common place to find them, with Anvil County and the Heartlands being where you'll find most of their population. Oddly enough, you'll actually find as many Wood Elves in Bruma County as you will in Kavach County, and you'll find less in Coral than both of those. That's somewhat surprising at face value, because Coral is within the Great Forest, so you think the Wood Elves would like to go live in the woods. I hope you find stats and data analysis interesting, because we're going in on another angle. This is going to rank all of the counties, including the total population of Cyrodiil, by their diversity index that we talked about earlier. And here we can see that Cyrodiil County is actually going to have the widest spread of race demographics across it, actually more than the total of Cyrodiil. This doesn't mean that there's more of each race in Cyrodiil County, of course. This just means that there's greater variation within Cyrodiil County than the whole of Cyrodiil. The regions with the least amount of variation are, unsurprisingly, those ones with very small populations and no large cities in the Imperial Reserve, and then the Nibene Basin. But the one with a city that has the least variation is Bruma, and again, that's where we see that massive Nord population, followed by a pretty large Imperial population, and then Bretons there as well. And there's not a whole lot going on in the other races, especially when compared to the other areas of Cyrodiil. Something I want to point out though, based on that Shannon Diversity Index scale, is that the vast majority of these regions are placed in the high diversity category. category. We only have 2 in moderate, in Bruma and then the Imperial Reserve, and then 1 in low, which is the Nibene Basin, and that only has a population of 3 or 3,000 people. This means of the counties with actual cities, Bruma is the only one that isn't in the high diversity category. And the larger point here is that all of these cities within Cyrodiil and all of their respective counties have a high variation when it comes to the races. You're seeing a lot of different peoples. There isn't a giant monoculture in any single one of them. This was a pretty interesting process overall, and I wasn't too surprised by what we got out of the data, but there were some interesting points like Skingrad having a really low population overall, or Anvil being one of the larger cities in terms of population. It was also interesting to discover that of the 9 major counties within Cyrodiil, the Imperials were only the largest population in 5 of those. If we include those other smaller counties, they aren't the majority in either of them, so that means that in less than half of the counties do you see Imperials as the largest race by percentage. I wouldn't have been surprised to see the Imperials have the largest population in all of the cities and then see a lot of variance in second and third place, but that's not the case. It's in almost half of the cities that you'll see Imperials aren't even the largest race. I would be really interested to see if Skyrim or even Morrowind share a consistent variation across their populations as well, or if this is specifically a Cyrodiil thing. And then down the road, as we do an assessment of each of those countries, perhaps if you guys are interested, I could compare entire nations and what their populations and demographics look like. If you're interested in how this process was carried out, I was able to install Microsoft Excel, R and RStudio on one of the terminals over here at the nvRanger & Co. offices. We then used RStudio and convenient libraries such as Plotly to create these nice little graphs and pie charts. Now I have to figure out how to get all this data on a piece of paper for that Imperial department. Maybe I could put it on an Elder Scroll. By the way, I gathered the data by walking around and counting up every single person.
Liar. Liar!
In other words, I used the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages thanks to them. I'll be honest, I think I screwed up the numbers a little bit towards the end when I remembered I should probably add in those individual inns and taverns that aren't within a city or right next to one. So the numbers might be slightly off by plus or minus 1 or 2, but overall I think this is a pretty comprehensive breakdown of the demographics and population of Cyrodiil when we're considering civilians, counts, people that are actually named NPCs. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you want to help us out over here at nvRanger & Co., you can like and subscribe, do all that nonsense down there. More importantly, I hope you're having a good day, and I'll see you in the comment section.